we have a problem. For those of you in this room that call yourself a Christian, that you believe in the lordship of Jesus, follow his way and his teachings, he said more than one time that if you believe in me as the Lord, the Messiah, if you follow my teachings and apply them to your life, the world will know who you are by your love. That's not how we're known. That's not what the world thinks of us. That's not what we are guilty of being, is too loving. And while this is a conversation much bigger than you or 242, it's a church problem. We don't have enough separation between church and hate. Those of us who call ourselves followers of Christ, the responsibility is ours to fix it. We have, you could say, a PR problem in this world. The wrong message has gotten out about who we are and about what we believe and why we believe it, and the communication of love has not come across clearly. We've messed up. And we show a video and a story like a Rodney that I love because it raises the tension and the awkwardness in the room for the right reason. Because it points out to us the conversations that we haven't had well, haven't handled well, the conversations we try to avoid, the things that we don't know how to answer and have just gone so poorly in the world around us. And what I love about Rodney's story is that's just Rodney's story. He's not arguing theology with us. He's not arguing biology with us. He's just telling you his journey and how he's arrived where he's at and the things that he's gone through in his life. But I know that some of you right now, it's just like, what are we about to say? Makes you anxious what we're going to do here for the next 25 minutes. And it's a tough issue for all of us. We all have our own stories. I mean, my own family, I have 2 members who are lesbians. They love each other. They've been in a relationship forever, and we love them. They love us. They're a huge, important part of our family. And they are not Christians. We do not share the same faith, and we do not agree on the topic of sexual orientation, but we love each other no less, and we're family no less. And we have stories of people like Rodney who this is their journey, and in church they felt like an outcast, and in culture they could not find peace, and the church wasn't what it needed to be in their journey, in their story. And I know you have stories like that in your own life. And I know for some of us, we grew up in decades, in the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, and before, where there were no Will and Grace shows, there was no Modern Family, the LGBT movement was not mainstream, and we said things we should not have said. We joked in ways that we should have never joked. We bullied, and we saw people bullied. And I am convinced, as a father, the thing that breaks my heart as a dad the most is when I see my boys bully each other, not take care of each other, pick on or be mean to one another. It breaks my heart. And I really think we are breaking the heart of our Heavenly Father. Because the love is not what's being communicated, and it's missing. And so we're doing this series, The Separation of Church and Hate, because we need to have conversations. And we need to step into places that we don't feel like we have all of the answers, and that's not the point, but to be what Jesus calls us to be for the world that is around us. And so we're doing this series. Now, to be clear, the topic is not about same-sex marriage or about sexual orientation. That's not the topic. We've taught on that stuff a bunch of times. We have, as followers of Christ, a peculiar view, which is we follow Jesus and his teachings. He said the world will know who you are, not just by your love, but that you take my teachings and you obey them. In Matthew 19, one of Jesus' teachings is what we hold as the institution of what marriage is, its design. He echoes and reteaches what Genesis 2 teaches, that marriage is made for a man and a woman. They get to call each other husband and wife. They get to have sex. That narrow little definition is what the view taught by Jesus is that we uphold. But it's so much bigger than talking about same-sex stuff, because what it means is that it applies to everything. It's why affairs are wrong, why we believe pornography is wrong, why we believe a lot of things don't fit inside that box. But even those are not the topic. The topic for us today, and for this series really, is that you and I have lost the ability to disagree with each other and still be in relationship. We have lost the ability to not agree on something and still respect one another and learn from one another and dialogue about the issues. We have fallen into the same trap we see in our culture where we're just outraged by everything and we banter on Facebook about it and we say stuff that's not fixing anything. And we're missing what Jesus modeled for us as the way to be love in the world around us. And this isn't just an us problem, obviously. It's a cultural problem we have. Christians and non-Christians alike have messed this up. In fact, just recently this happened to one of our pastors on staff here. Ever since we opened up this building, There have been a lot of shots fired and bricks thrown because they feel like we are bigots and we are full of hate because we don't do non-Christian marriages based on our narrow definition that we have from our faith. And it's not true. We are not full of hate and we're not bigots, but that's how people feel. And there's been very little conversation, just lots of things said about us. And anyway, what happened just like 2 weeks ago is one of our pastors is at a local business and he's with his family and he's wearing a shirt that was a 242 Community Center shirt. And this lady had noticed that and then was leaving at the same time he was. And in the parking lot, in front of her own kids, she looked at him and said, "You know what? You're an a-hole." But she didn't use the letter A. I know. And she was not there to have any kind of a conversation with him, but just accuse him and tell him what he believes, even though he's like, after like the shock wore off, he's like, "Wait, hang on. I don't hate anybody." Like he's trying to figure out if I stole your groceries or something. Like I don't know what just happened. And he tried to have a conversation with her, which she was not having. He offered to meet with her to talk more about it, at least to understand why we would believe what we believe. The point is just that there's a lot of hate on both sides and a lot of misunderstanding on both sides, and I believe we are breaking the heart of our Heavenly Father with it all. How many of you, show of hands, would agree that we're probably breaking God's heart with all this hate and anger and disagreement, that there's no discourse, there's no conversation, nobody's learning anything, we're just standing more firm in our own beliefs. And so what's the answer? What's the answer, you guys? Jesus. Come on, we're in church. It's always the answer. Jesus. I teed that up for you. It was easy. Jesus is the answer, and I don't say that like just to be funny. The way that Jesus lived his life and the love that he modeled is the answer for those of us following that he calls to be his hope and his reflection to this world that is around us. And unfortunately, our culture thinks the answer is tolerance. That the way for us to get through all this is just tolerance. It's tolerance. It doesn't matter what your political views are, or your sexual orientation, or your religion, just tolerance. Well, how's tolerance doing? Right? Tolerance only goes as far as we agree with each other, and it ends there every time. Just for a moment, turn to the person next to you and say, "I tolerate you." Let them know. Literally, I'm just putting up with you and your presence on this planet. Come on, is that the best we can do? Can you imagine walking down the aisle on your wedding day, standing before God, family, and friends, looking your future spouse in the eyes and saying, through thick and thin, for rich or for poor, I will tolerate you. That's not it. And that's not the answer. And it's not gonna get us anywhere. And the way of Jesus calls us to model and to show the beauty and the complexity of a love that's willing to suffer, a love that's willing to die on a cross, a love that's willing to take offense and to take shots and false accusations and misunderstanding and love you anyway, because what we believe is so much bigger than any social issue. If you're a follower of Christ in this room, you should be the hardest person on the planet to offend. What could possibly shake you when your belief is in something so big and powerful? When you believe in a truth that can prove itself. We should never be taking up arms and losing influence over opinions. We're missing the point and the way of love. And so it's why we need to talk about this, because Christians, well-meaning, have gotten wrapped up in the power struggles of this world, and without meaning to, have looked to elections and laws and Facebook arguments like that's their hope and that's what's gonna fix the world, and it's not. We've gotten wrapped up in trying to legislate our faith and morality. Think about it like this. I grew up in church, so I've been around a lot of generations where everybody laments how messed up culture is and Christians are the minority and all this different stuff. Do you know how many times I've heard Christians talk about how sad it was in the 50s when they took prayer out of school? Think for a moment of what that actually was. Forcing people without faith in Jesus to pray to him is more attuned with terrorism than it is with the way of Jesus. That's not what Jesus is about. That doesn't even make sense. And we get wrapped up in all this conversation, and it's just a big exercise in missing the whole point. And then it's so important because we live in a time that we are so devisely divided. We demonize and we polarize and we miss it. One of my favorite pastors to listen to as a preacher, his name is Ephraim Smith. And in a sermon a little over a year ago, right after Trump got elected and people were losing their minds, he said this in the sermon at the opening. He said, "We are living in the land of the free, but the home of the divided." And he went on to put the church on trial and talk about how we, the Christians, are so divided racially. How we, the Christians, are so divided and we look to political parties to be the answer that actually only we are equipped to be for this world. We miss the point and we miss the love and the things that Jesus very intentionally went out of his way to model for us. And so that's what I want to do with you today is I want to walk through one of the more powerful examples of Jesus showing us what a lifestyle of love looks like. And you and I could use this to apply this to our lives. And we see Jesus do this all the time where he'll step past the cultural norms, he'll step past what religious people say was acceptable and make everybody mad in the process to teach us really important things about what love actually looks like. So if you have a Bible, open up your Bible app to John chapter 4. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the fourth gospel eyewitness account of who Jesus was and what he did and why he did it. And in John chapter 4, we'll start in verse 4 in just a second. The context is that Jesus has been teaching with authority, claiming things, doing things, making religious people mad. So they're starting to turn the heat up, the religious authority. They don't like him and they want him gone. And so he's going to leave the southern area of Israel, which is where Jerusalem is. It's called Judea. He's going to leave the region of Judea, where he'd been, and he's going to go back up north to Galilee, where he spent most of his time around the Sea of Galilee in those cities like Capernaum. So that's where he's going. That's the context. Here's what happens. Start verse 4. Ready? Now he, being Jesus, and he's got his disciples with him, had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from his journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." Now, we don't have time to read the entire story. It's powerful. If you've never read it or haven't read it recently, you should read this story every day. Read John 4 every day this week and just let it challenge you and speak to you. But what happens in this little story, in this little moment, Jesus models for us three specific things that are how to live the kind of love, model the kind of love for this world around us, because we have peculiar views. We just do. Whether you're talking about sexuality or how we spend our money and whatever, we should live the kind of life that is peculiar but loving in the way that it attracts people's curiosity, and they're like, "Why are you different than me? What do you mean you don't sleep around with whoever whenever you want? Don't you want to have fun in life?" No. We just believe there's a better way. We live life differently, but marked by love, not in repulsing our culture, but in attracting them to it. So here's the first thing we see. Jesus shows us that love, in the way that he models for us, love takes the road less traveled. Love takes the road less traveled. Love takes you in places beyond your comfort zone. Love leads you into the awkwardness and the tension and the needs and the brokenness and the messiness of this world. And the tidier your life is in your social circles, probably the less you're really loving the world the way Jesus calls you to. I mean, it said he had to go to Samaria. Now, this logically makes sense. This is a map of what Israel looked like in the first century when Jesus was there. So there's the Judea region, Samaria in the middle, Galilee in the north. And so that if you're going from the south to the north, obviously you had to go through Samaria. That's the most efficient path to follow. Go north. Remember, you're on your feet, you're walking, so you're not gonna walk in circles or unnecessary distances. Walk straight. Jews didn't do that. Jews took that little white dotted path because they hated Samaria and Samaritans. They would walk around, literally, they would walk down towards Jericho into the Jordan Valley and north and back. This would double their travel time. That's how much they went out of their way to avoid Samaria. And so that Jesus had to go there, he is intentionally teaching us and showing us something of what love actually looks like, of how love crosses borders and boundaries of what people think is appropriate and acceptable. And in this case, one of the reasons Jews and Samaritans did not get along was racial. About 600 years earlier, when the then powerful empire was Assyria and had conquered Israel, Some Assyrians and some Jewish people began to intermarry, and it became this new people group, the Samaritans. Assyrians who are Jews are Samaritans. And they live in the same place. They have a ton of religious similarities, and they hated each other. Racially, the Jews saw Samaritans as half-breeds and dogs, and they hated them. They didn't associate with them. And Jesus is demonstrating that love will not only cause us to go down roads less traveled, but beyond our comfort zone and to cross paths. What Jesus is modeling for you and I, it's like a question that he's asking you. Like where is the Samaria you're avoiding in your life? Who or what? When was the last time you intentionally put yourself in a place where the majority of people you are around disagree with you politically or theologically or philosophically? Because love calls you to those places. What's the last relationship you've cultivated and spent time with a person who you know lives life differently, believes differently than you? Or have you just created them as a Samaria in your life that you go around, that you avoid? Because see, if you're not careful, you and I, we are so guilty of being inside our own little bubbles. You could call them echo chambers. Echo chambers is actually like a scientific term, but there's a social application to it. An echo chamber is an environment in which a person encounters only beliefs or opinions that coincide with their own, so that their existing views are reinforced and alternative ideas are not considered. Now, most of the time in our culture, when people talk about the echo chambers, they refer to like people who only listen to Fox News or people who only listen to CNN. That's like scratching the surface of the echo chamber problem in our culture. We live in a digital age. The way marketing works is that your cookies and your cache and your purchase history means there are people with algorithms just tailoring content to you that they think you're most likely to purchase or to read. And if you don't realize this, you are inside a serious echo chamber of only interacting with people who think like you and look like you and believe like you. And you know this is true because you've heard a news story of something that happened in some people group that did some crazy thing, and you're like, wait, what? Like those people exist out there? Because you think everybody's like you. And if you're not careful, not only does love never take you down the paths that are less traveled and beyond your comfort zone, you don't even interact with anybody who actually thinks different than you. And that's a big problem, which leads to the second thing that Jesus models for us here, that love listens. Love doesn't just go to places and like beyond comfort zones and roads less traveled. Love listens to people. Listening is active, and listening is a form of love. It's hearing someone, not trying to fix someone. It's listening to them. It's demonstrating what love and grace looks like. And it's a little hard for us in this little story here of Jesus' life to kind of glaze over the magnitude of its importance. Because for Jesus to even have this conversation with this woman is just like paramount. Like I guarantee you when his disciples got back from buying food, they're like, what are you doing? Men did not speak to women they did not know or who were not their wives. Jews did not speak to Samaritans ever. A rabbi who's teaching with authority, who's got all these people who are like, think he's awesome, like someone who's growing in like as a celebrity in their culture, Jesus, to talk to a Samaritan woman, let alone a woman who's coming to the well at noon. Because what's happening that we find out as you continue to read the story is this woman struggled with her own sexual sins. And Jesus is going to talk to her about those. But the reason she would come at noon, which is like when it's really hot and inconvenient to ever go get water, it's because she was not welcomed, or she did not want the scorn of her community at the normal time in the morning when everybody would come get water. Because of her mistakes and past relationships, she was an outcast of her own community, judged. And here she is at that moment of the day, and Jesus is not just having a conversation with a woman or a Samaritan woman, but one with a little bit of a reputation. And Jesus demonstrates to us in this conversation what love does, and it listens and it takes people off guard when we're not offended, when we don't jump to debate, but when we just hear them. And for Jesus, it begins to unravel the tangled mess of this woman's life, and it opens up doors for him to speak truth to her. The Jews, they were so divided. And it wasn't just racial, it was also even religious to them, because while their religions, they both believed in Moses. But the Jews would say, well, you can only worship in the temple in Jerusalem. And the Samaritans were like, no, we have our own temple that they had built on Mount Gerizim, and they believed in Moses and the teachings. And they had disagreements about the other books of the Old Testament, and they fought. And they disagreed, and it's part of the other complexity and the reason that they didn't get along. In fact, in verse 19, the woman calls it out, this tension between them. In verse 19, she said, "Sir, I can see that you're a prophet." Now at this point, Jesus is like starting to read her mail, which only he can do. And so she's like, something's different in this conversation that's happening. So she perceives that there's something bigger that's happening in this conversation with him. And she says, "Our ancestors worshiped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." There's racial issues and theological issues and differences, but what Jesus is modeling is that love listens. So what's your Samaria that you need to listen to? Who's the Samaritan that you've created at your workplace that you avoid, the Samaria in your neighborhood that you go around, the social circles that you've created that are echo chambers where you're not listening to the world God's placed you in, not so that you can feel at odds or tension with them, but that you could be love for them. Who is that? What is that? And it leads us to the last thing that Jesus models for us. And this is where it gets really tough. Love takes the road less traveled, and love listens. But Jesus also shows us that love speaks hard truth, but in a gentle way. Love speaks truth. A love without truth is meaningless. A truth with no love is just mean. But the way of Jesus is a love and a truth. They're always together. It's what love actually is. Read verse 10 again with me. We read it at the beginning. Jesus answered her. Listen to the claim he's making of truth here. "If you had knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water." This is what we talked about with Easter last week. Jesus is claiming to be the source of life in this account. Other times you would say, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life." It's a rather exclusive claim to make. Last week we talked about how what part of the Easter story is Jesus saying that truth is not some intellectual thing to grasp, that it's a person to know, "I am the truth and I am the source of life." You came here thirsty looking for something, but you're looking for something that to quench the real spiritual thirst in your life, and you'll never find it in men or in relationships or in this well. It's me. See, what Jesus is claiming, this is really important for us to understand, especially if you're following Jesus and you want to not keep messing this up in culture. What Jesus is saying, he's inviting you and I to point our life at him like he's our true north, like this. He's our true north. He's our truth. He's the one we follow. And if you take John chapter 4 and you back up a couple of chapters to John chapter 1, there's this poetic opening of this big theological claim that in the beginning was the Word was Jesus, everything came into being through him, and then in verse 14, he became flesh, he stepped onto earth. And he was the embodiment of grace and truth. That you cannot have Jesus without grace, and you can't have him without truth. You can't have grace without truth or truth without grace. They go together because that's who he is. And then we also know that there's this claim that he makes, and the others would believe and affirm that he is both holy and human. What this means is that Jesus chose to walk a more narrow, harder path. It would have been easy for him, think about this, just to come and be holy. Like, don't be born in a manger, be born in a palace. Don't even touch the earth. Just float around like David Blaine and freak people out and let them always know that you're holy and a Messiah. That would have made more sense. Or just be human and just one of us. He totally gets us and he relates, but he was both at the same time. He was human, but he was perfect. He was like us, but he was set apart. And he calls those of us who put our faith in his grace and his truth to be like that. Human, we mess up, but set apart and always trying to be better. But here's where we mess this up. This is what we do, especially church people. We get all religious and we love to add complexity and start trying to control stuff. And without maybe even meaning to, we start focusing so much on the holiness side of our belief in Jesus that we ultimately lead us to being really legalistic, and we sacrifice grace in the process every time. You cannot have truth without grace. It just hurts people. But we do it on the other side too, without meaning to. We know Jesus, he loves us, he's got tons of grace, and we're all human, we mess up, and so we say things like, just you be you, you do your thing, I won't worry about it, it's not my business. And we lean way too much to just the human side of our faith, and in the end, we become very liberal with Jesus' truth, and we sacrifice it in the process. It is truth and it is grace together. You cannot separate them in the teachings of Jesus. He doesn't shy away from speaking truth and making bold claims, but he never does it without love. In fact, the Apostle Paul in the great chapter of love in 1 Corinthians 13, Before he defines what love actually is, he would talk about how you can have all kinds of religious experiences and spiritual gifts and talents, but if you lack love, you're nothing. In fact, specifically, he says you're like a sounding gong or a clanging cymbal. You're annoying. That if all you have is a hold of a bunch of truth, you can be completely wrong in the way you handle it with this world when you lack love. So Jesus makes this claim in verse 10, and then he says it even more pointed in verse 13. Verse 13 of chapter 4, he says, everyone who drinks this water, speaking of that well, will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. Not only am I claiming to be the source of life and the quencher of the thirst that's really inside your soul, but I will create in you this love that will pour out and be in a reflection of that to the world. That as you are restored and you are healed and you grow in relationship, you will become my reflection of hope and grace and truth to this world. So think for a moment. Who is the person in your life that's the hardest to love? Picture that person that you work with that just annoys you, that person in your family who never stops talking about politics, that neighbor you have who's the hardest person to love in your life? Now picture just for a moment that you are that person to God. You are broken. You sin. And your sin is not better than anybody's sin. Your sins aren't smaller or more acceptable. Sin is sin. And because of our belief in the Easter story, we read it last week, Christ died for you and I while we were still sinners. And he invites us to be like that for others. Imagine that person they're the hardest person to love. Imagine enduring a beating for that person. Imagine enduring the cross for that person, because Jesus says that's exactly what love does. It suffers. It's self-sacrificing. It's beyond its own comfort zone. It feels often ill-equipped. It just keeps loving. It doesn't have all the answers and it can't fix everyone, but it knows the truth. Like, I don't know what all this means to you today and what this conversation stirs within you, but I know every one of us has a next step to take.